where he's taught for 35 years. He's an expert on 20th century Florida, and he's published numerous books and articles, several of which have been recognized, including Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams, A Social History of Modern Florida, which was awarded the Charles Thibault Prize in 2006 by the Florida Historical Society. Currently, he writes a bi-weekly column on state and local history for the Tampa Tribune. Dr. Mormino received his PhD from the University of North Carolina. I couldn't find the date, so 77, okay. In 2003, the Florida Humanities Council named him its first Humanist of the Year. Dr. Mormino.
Thanks for coming. I was thinking that World War II in Florida is the last kind of bauble on the bead that connects so many of these previous papers. That for the last time, I mean, Florida was in peril. If you think about the themes from the previous 2 days, it's one of crisis and catastrophe. Global cooling and then global warming, the extinction of megafauna, European contact, plague, pandemics, military invasion, forced evacuation, mass starvation, transfer of empires and colonies, slave rebellions, Indian wars, a civil war. And if days after Pearl Harbor, I mean, we know now the United States and the Allies emerged triumphantly, but it didn't seem that way in late December 1941, if you look at the daunting challenges to the United States. It's also, World War II is I think why it's such a compelling topic. We're seeing what Floridians saw in 1941, the vanishing Civil War generation. In fact, it's precisely the number of years separating the beginning of the Civil War and Pearl Harbor as it is from Pearl Harbor to 2013, about 71, 72 years. Out of curiosity, I don't think, are there any Civil War or World War II vets? World War II vets in the audience? How many of you had a brother or a sister in the war? I'm surprised, only a few. Father or mother in the war. It's interesting, the last class I taught was World War II. About half the class was comprised of senior auditors and the other half traditional 18 to 20 years old. And I asked everyone, tell me about your personal relationship to World War II. And those 50, 60 and older often had a brother, certainly a father. That was still very tangible. For most 18-year-olds, the war is, I mean, I think my great-grandfather fought in World War II. What theater? I'm not sure. It's distant. World War II is more separated. Let me put it another way. When I was a freshman in college, if my professor had told me, you've got to study the Spanish-American War, it is vital. The Spanish-American War in 1965 was 67 years old. To a college freshman today, Pearl Harbor is 72 years away. So, I mean, there's some distance there. Beginning of the war. By the way, that's got to be one of the great headlines. One of the printers at the St. Petersburg Times was saving red ink, thinking something big was going to happen. And it's probably the biggest story. I must have 300 or 400 interviews, biographical entries of Floridians telling me about how they heard about Pearl Harbor. How many of you, honestly now, could identify Colin Kelly? If I said, how many of you, sometimes Colin Kelly. Colin Kelly in late January 1942 was the greatest hero in America. It really, in some ways, he was the only hero we had. What Floridians, he was from Madison, Florida, a West Point graduate. What Americans had been told in the newspaper is that he managed to get his B-17 in the air, It was badly shot up by Japanese Zeros. He ordered his crew to bail out, and he guided the B-17 into the Japanese destroyer, the Haruna. Denied the Medal of Honor primarily because I think he was naval air. Later in the war, we discovered he did not sink the Haruna. The Haruna was still floating at the end of the war, but he was a hero, and we needed a hero in 1941.
You didn't tell us he was the first one to die.
No. But this happened about 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor.
He's the first Floridian to die.
No, there are other Floridians died. He was the first martyr of the war, you could say, the first hero of the war. In fact, probably a couple dozen Floridians died at Pearl Harbor, I know. To show you how lonely I am in reading microfilm, I'm reading the Gadsden County Times a few years ago in the University of Florida archives, and I come across this microfilm, and it's an amazing story. First of all, the check, I remember having to return, and it turned out that in Gadsden, Florida, a group of businessmen put up $50 for the first local boy to kill a Japanese soldier. And this happened all over Florida and America. I've never heard of an instance putting up money to kill a German or Italian soldier, although Fuller Warren, future Florida governor, wrote in an editorial in many Florida papers why he was volunteering for the war. He said, I want to kill Germans and Japs. He said, I will not kill Italians whom I consider craven cowards. And he became our governor in 1948. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Eugene Lyon, did you not observe a burning tanker off Miami? Did you not tell me that years ago? Anyone else from St. Augustine observe as a child, a young child, a burning tanker? Well, the war came to Florida in tangible, visceral ways in February 1942. Those of you who have read Michael Gannon's book on Operation Drumbeat, the Germans had a brilliant campaign to wage U-boat warfare on the high seas. And they sank 24 American vessels between mainly 1942 and 1943. And Helen Muir, the famous journalist in the Miami Herald, tells the story that she observed a mariner who had been covered with oil, and the nurse was dabbing the oil off him, and she was nervous and wanted to initiate a conversation, so she began, is this your first visit to Florida? The war came to this coast in a pretty amazing way in June of 1942. In fact, the reason the Germans landed at Vero Beach, if you go to the Ponte Vedra. If you go to the Ponte Vedra Country Club there, there's a marker where the German U-boats land. The U-boat permitted 6 Germans to row ashore in a rubber dinghy. They were wearing a swimming suit. They had bags of munitions, bags of money, and they were wearing their German mariner hats with the Nazi insignia. Now, someone always notices, why, if you were a German saboteur, would you wear a hat with a Nazi insignia? There was a very good reason. No, exactly. They wanted to be a prisoner of war, if captured, rather than a spy or saboteur. And in fact, they were one of them ratted on the others, and they were all arrested. 2 of the 12. There was also an expedition of the same sort in Long Island, New York. Of the 12 Germans, 10 were executed, I think, or of the 8, 6 were executed. But that's quite a headline. Stark, Florida, 1941. First of all, I think that's one of the great photographs in Florida history. We don't know anything about those guys. Would love to know what happened to the gentleman. I want to read you. It's one of my favorite quotes. In 1942, the New York Sun newspaper gave their lead reporter, Ward Morehouse, money, gas coupons, and they said, take your car, stop along, find out where's the pulse beat of the war. How can you take the... And he lands in Stark, Florida, and he's overwhelmed. By the way, this is one of the most remarkable passages. First of all, the opening sentence. If you're an English major, grab your reader first. Stark is gauche. Now, I'm quite certain it's the first time the word gauche and Stark ever began and ended a sentence. But what a stylist. He said, in its present incarnation, Stark is a town created and spoiled by defense dollars. With its overlighted facades, its blazing interiors, its fluorescent tubings, its while you wait photo studios, its hell-red neons, its cheap jewelry displays, and its gaudy movie palace, Stark has gone from a population of 1,500, home of the sweetest strawberries in the land, to a population of nobody knows what. Stark is an overnight gold rush town as a result of the national emergency. It is as fantastic a spot as America now presents. And I mean, think of that, Stark, Florida, and it was because of Camp Landing. But overnight, Florida goes from a handful of military installations in 1941 to almost 200, including mega-sized bases such as MacDill Field in Tampa, Eglin Airfield in the Panhandle, Pensacola Naval Air Station. And I think this is if there's a photo that connects this conference, it's this photo. I mean, think about St. Augustine, a garrison town. A town, I mean, how many times have soldiers mobilized here in emergencies? And in World War II, the Ponce de Leon is taken over by the Coast Guard. And the Navy. Navy also there. Did you date any Navy guys?
No, it was my dad.
But I love that shot there. In Miami Beach, Clark Gable might have been in that formation marching. Jacksonville Naval Air Station. Interesting personalities. We believe that about 2 million servicemen and women trained in Florida. The figures are imprecise because it's absolute chaos. You can have people coming in for a few days or a year, but always flux. And you have to put this in perspective. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, Florida was the smallest state in the American South. Smaller than the population of Arkansas or South Carolina. And now with all these people, by the way, the back row, the tallest guy in the back row, that's George Herbert Walker Bush, who turned down entry into Yale to enter Naval Air and is at the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station. Also, interestingly, St. Augustine had 2 interesting people here. 60 Minutes guy, he just died. Andy Rooney. Andy Rooney was stationed at Camp Landing, but they lost his papers, so he had no duties. He had just been married. Every morning he would drive for a rendezvous with his wife who was in St. Augustine. And also, but more interesting is the black artist Jacob Lawrence, he of the Great Migration series. If you go to Jacksonville, you have to get entry to the home, the Vickers collection there. I'm looking at that a few months ago, and there's this remarkable painting. It says St. Augustine Juke Joint. And it's Jacob Lawrence as a Coast Guardman with his friends dancing with black St. Augustine women. And Lawrence, black man in the Coast Guard, he was assigned to Ponce de Leon, but in a room that was reserved for the, quote, colored maid. But he said it was one of the great experiences of his life. Paul Newman and George Wallace were stationed in Miami. Don't you wonder if you were writing a novel of Paul Newman and George Wallace just talking about the future, improbable as that is? Of course, Clark Gable. Ted Williams was a flight instructor at Panama City, Tyndall Air Base. If I could go back into a time machine, this is where I would go, to the Tampa shipyards in 1944, I think this is. But wouldn't you love to know what happened to those women and their backgrounds? About 20 years ago, when I was at USF Tampa, a columnist for the Tribune, his mother worked at the Tampa shipyards. So I asked him to do a column, and the idea was any women who worked in the Tampa shipyards, by the way, there were about 10,000 such women, earning union wages at this time. Please bring your photos, your memories, and show up to the USF Library. About 200 women showed up, and with their union badges and everything. But very few Rosie the Riveters served in Florida. There was no aircraft manufacturing. These were Joans of Arc. They were welders, arc welders. But look at those outfits. One woman I interviewed told me she grew up on a farm in Florida. The first time she ever wore trousers was as a welder. Even at the farm, a lady wouldn't wear trousers. I must have 300 such clippings on this. The first. This is the first woman meter reader in St. Petersburg. The first trolley conductor. The first woman butcher in Tampa. I mean, just forever. Someone once said there are even now lumberjills to go along with lumberjacks in Florida. But that's one of the great themes. It's also a great argument among historians who are always arguing over what's the meaning of this. Okay, so you've got extraordinary number of women working. What does it mean? And the first generation of scholars writing in the 60s wrote, this was a revolutionary experience. This was the seedbed of the women's movement in the 60s. Interestingly, their daughters writing in the 70s and 80s often wrote, it wasn't as unsettling as you would think. It was their daughters who became the activists. That most women who worked in World War II didn't want to work the rest of their lives. They wanted to get married, they wanted to have kids. It's their daughters who had bigger dreams or different dreams. They're all dreams. This is a wonderful quote here. If you can't read it, Bob, you want to read that for everyone? This is from the Miami Herald, 1943, I believe.
Here we go. War has brought many changes and many new faces to Stewart Martin County's capital, and some of the residents have become a bit disturbed by the costumes of the many servicemen's wives now residing there. The Stewart City Fathers at their last meeting were asked to regulate the wearing apparel of women in the business section, but shied away from it with the observation that, quote, very short skirts and brief halters may be more appropriate on Miami Beach than on Flagler and Osceola Avenue in Stewart, unquote. Request table.
So you have, I must have a half a dozen of these, and it's particularly small town Florida, the turbulence of having so many newcomers bringing new values. By the way, this is also true among African Americans, particularly African Americans who had been raised in the North. They felt if I'm in uniform, I'll be damned if I can't buy a beer anywhere I want if I'm willing to die. And so you had a lot, they called them race riots in the 40s. We would probably call them melees, but it's nonetheless interesting. This is one of the most, Jane, can you read that? Yes, this a female voice would be better. This is one of the most touching pieces I've read. It's from the Miami Daily News, 1943.
Mothers with babies in carriages were there. Mothers with babies in their arms. Mothers with toddlers. Mothers with babies in their laps. Tired mothers, footsore and weary mothers. It says indignant mothers, but I think it means indignant mothers and pitiful mothers. Why did you come here? We asked over and over again. The answer is always the same. This is his port of embarkation. He will come back here. We thought we could have just a few more months of life together. He may not come back. He wanted to see the baby so much. She was born 2 weeks after he shipped out, and she's 2 years old now.
Every city in Florida is overwhelmed by people, particularly military towns. There's no place to stay. I always cry when I read that, so thank you. How many of you, I'm guessing the answer is going to be very few. How many of you know the name Mary Lou Baker? Mary Lou Baker. I am still pissed off about this. Mary Lou Baker, should be in the Florida Women's Hall of Fame, and I have nominated her for about 20 straight years. And Mary Lou Baker is the only woman in the Florida legislature in World War II. She's a lawyer. She lives in Pinellas County. And she passes, during the war, what's popularly known as the Women's Emancipation Bill. Now, it's fascinating what is considered emancipation by 1943 standards. It gave women the right to take care of their property. Prior to this, the moment you were married in Florida, your husband inherited your property and the right to transfer it. She tried to get women the right to serve on juries, but that failed. That would be passed a few years later. But what an interesting figure that she could get that passed during the war. And in fact, it's probably not coincidental. If you think of women's suffrage in World War I, during World War II, race tensions are stirred and emboldened. In 1944, the Supreme Court passes the Smith versus Allwright decision, prohibiting the white primary. And to give you an idea of perspective on this, Claude Pepper, who was in 1944 probably the most liberal senator in the U.S. South, Claude Pepper is also running for re-election, and he's worried not to be flanked by the right on this. So Claude Pepper is actually using the word white supremacy. Now, no one pays any attention to this, but in fact, within a few years, Florida will have a greater percentage of black registered voters. What they want to do is register in the Democratic primary, because in a one-party state, that's the only vote that counted was the primary. Florida passed what was called work or fight laws. If you're not in uniform and you're unemployed, you could be put in jail. Which I'm not sure I have a problem with that in a total war, but the problem, of course, was that it wasn't applied fairly. Almost always African Americans were rounded up, impressed even by the county sheriff to pick crops, because the traditional compliant workforce in agriculture, African Americans, were moving on. They had moved north, or they had taken better jobs. And in fact, it's during World War II, really for the first time in substantial numbers, Caribbean laborers are brought in as migrant laborers. It's actually part of a program. How am I doing? Have I got a minute? War ends, appropriate. World War II is the linchpin between this underdeveloped, sparsely settled Florida, smallest population in the South, and a state that perhaps today, no one's quite sure when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen any moment now. A retired auto worker, a transplanted accountant from Kokomo, a Cuban utility infielder, or a Venezuelan millionaire will walk through Florida, and Florida will surpass New York as the third largest state. That's unimaginable, but that's for the next session. Thank you so much.
I'm going to open the floor for questions so that we all can eat. So anyone interested in bringing up some of the points that officers raised so wonderfully, please go to the microphone.
Oh, I take the mic? All right. Mine's for Dr. Grant. Dr. Grant is so eloquently called the administration or the Democrat Party the Bourbon Democrats. Now, I know there has to be a reason for that, so I'd like you to explain it.
Yeah, it's really Bourbon, from the French ruling family that never learned anything and never forgot anything. The idea was these are the old timers. But in fact, they really weren't old timers. In some ways they were, but they were looking forward to a new Florida, a Florida that would have railroads and thriving businesses and a growing population.
The only old-time thing they wanted was to keep the old-time race relations the way they were, African Americans in their place. And spite of the fact they were interested in, as Professor Graham said, new economic opportunities, but old race relations.
I can tell a story about Nakazi. Thanks. This is a good group to tell this to. I've been in politics, and not helped and not hurt by what I do. But I go through a little town as I go to San Island and Captiva. I go to a little town called Nocatee. It's just south of Arcadia. And the Baileys have always been in the citrus business and always were buying their packing crates. And Dr. Graham, that's one of the things the lumber was used for, was packing crates for all the citrus that went north to New York so that you can get it there in a day's time. Well, I knocked on doors down there, found some history of Nocatee. The name came about, it looks like it's in Arcadia the way you just drive through. The name came about because the Indians were not aware of this big machine, the railroad, coming into town. And so when it did get there, they had the dedication of the railroad, the Indians were all there asking, what Nocatee? Nocatee means, what is it? Get it? What is it? And that is the reason the expression came about. And so we ended up here with developers, as you mentioned, coming in, and they're still coming in. But I think that's an interesting story because what came out from those builders was that it meant something about beautiful land. And I can tell you after traveling over Florida on horseback that is one of the things about this area. It is the beautiful land. Thank you.
I think that's a great way to end this session, talking about old Florida, meeting new Florida. Some things change, some things don't, but it's still Florida, whatever that is. Thanks, we'll see you after lunch.